Kano Malam was off the coast of East Africa when Vasco da Gama turned up looking for India. I mean, I'm not quite sure how that happened. Vasco turned up, excuse me, where is India? And Kano Malam was in the story in possession of superior navigational skills, which shows that Indian navigation at the time was superior to that of the Portuguese. So Kano Malam was able to show him from the east coast of Africa to Calicut. Now, the Karwa Samaj, Manvi's sailing community, have a monthly magazine. They had a monthly magazine in which they present community history stories. And they rightly pointed out in their history story that in some ways it was very good that Kano Malam had the superior navigation skills to Vasco da Gama, and he should be venerated as a hero because of that, but he had also brought the colonial power to India, and perhaps he shouldn't be celebrated for having introduced 400 years of oppressive rule. Anyway, the Karwa Samaj were a little bit ambiguous about that in the end. But it is also the case that Zanzibar claimed their own version of Kano Malam, and so does Oman. And Oman have gone to the point of creating a museum about, I think they call him Ibn Majid. So there's an entire museum dedicated to how Ibn Majid was able to show Vasco da Gama the way from East Africa to Calicut. But I think having said that, I don't know whether it's a question of authentication or not. I think actually it's more interesting than saying, well, it's not a Gujarat story, or it's not a Zanzibar story, or it's an Indian Ocean story. And I think that the circulation of people in the Indian Ocean and the ubiquity of that idea probably resonates quite strongly with a deep sense that they did have superior navigation skills to Vasco da Gama. And Vasco da Gama entered into a dynamic arena where people were interconnected, where stories travelled, where perhaps it was not easy to tell whether someone was Gujarati, Zanzibari or Omani in the first place, because those people were circulating just as the contemporary post-colonial myth of Kano Malam or Ibn Majid, call him what you will, is circulating in the Indian Ocean.
The Arabs used to operate sailing ships, and they were called dhows, and they used to carry cargo. Actually, primarily they used to carry cargo from India, spices, and take them to Zanzibar and Mombasa. And in return, they would carry cloths from Zanzibar to India. And they used to take 30 days traveling from Bombay to African coasts. And there are many an example of families having disappeared altogether without any trace, because if there was a storm, the dhow will not make it. So when, like my father said, that when they boarded the dhow in Bombay, they would take a coconut and put it in the water, which is the final ritual when a person dies. So they used to say, we used to perform our own ceremony before boarding the dhow. So if it is disappeared, then our coconut was already put in the ocean. So that was the risk. The other thing is that when they reached Africa, they knew that there was no civilization there. The people were very uncivilized, lots of mosquitoes, malaria, wildlife, snakes. So they used to say that one who goes to Africa never comes back. And yet people used to do it because they had no money. They were not earning anything in India, and there was no opportunity to earn anymore. So they left the shores of India because of that. This is what I would say is the cause of the diaspora.
So the first Oshwal from Rafudal decided, because they were all facing a lot of difficulties because of the famine, and he decided with his friend from Dunia and another friend from Amla. These three villages are part and parcel of the 52 villages in Kathiawad, which were settled by the Visha Oshwal community. Mostly they were Jains. And so these three people ventured, came by dhows, came to Kenya in 1899. The famine was so severe, many families had to sell their children. You know, it was that bad. So some went to Bombay and other countries, but they never succeeded, came back, the youngsters. And then finally, between 1899 and 1910, very many young people from different families, Oshwal families who were Gujaratis, came to Kenya. The railway had reached Nairobi around 1899 as well. And it was going to open up because it was it was Uganda Railway first time. Because the whole purpose was that they wanted to reach Uganda and beat the German influence or explore German influence in Tanzania. So they thought that they would also go into Uganda. So the British took a lead, and the Imperial British East Africa decided to build a railway line from Mombasa to Kisumu, and then to further on into Uganda in Jinja and Kampala, you know.
Well, for some in the 1890s, the British wanted to build railways from Mombasa to Nairobi and then to Uganda. And they approached the local African tribes and they said, we will not build this iron snake. They call it iron snake. So the British decided to import, well, I would say import, the Indians, you know, from India, especially from Gujarat and other states, to work and build these railways. So that's how, first of all, the Indians were established in East Africa, where they used to work on these railways. And they used to work all sorts of hours, and many of them got killed by the lions because it was such a wild country. And they suffered quite a bit because, you know, they were sort of workers, basically they were laborers who used to carry, the British were the masters, and they would instruct them to carry and build the railway in the way they wanted it. So there were literally hundreds and hundreds of Indians who went initially for that purpose. But I think what history doesn't mention is that there are a lot of Gujaratis who were there before as traders, especially in Zanzibar, in Mombasa and Dar es Salaam, where they were well before the British decided to import the Indians to work on the railways. And their sole purpose was to trade. You know, they were traders, and they would trade with Arabs, you know, from the sort of, if you look at Oman, you know, from the Arabian Peninsula to East African coast. And this trade, you know, anything from spices, and they would exchange goods for something else and so on, or barter something. So those were the sort of trading links which were established. And the point which you just raised about, yes, I think some of the people were not doing so well in Gujarat. And they wanted to have a better life, education and so on. The other thing was the family link. I think, say for example, if once my father went to Masindi and so on, and then he sent a passage to my uncle. I said, look, please you come and come to Africa. There's a lot of opportunities here, and you know, you'd have a good life here. You make some money, you look after your children and so on. So one of his uncles did take up the offer, and he came to Uganda. And then after that, he sent money for the third uncle, and he never came. He said, no, I don't want to live in India. I want to stay in Gujarat, and I'm happy with what I have. So the family links brought people from Gujarat to Africa, East Africa. And the trading links, and also what had happened was once the railway was built, the Indians who stayed back, or they didn't have anything to do, established shops, dukawalas, which is very famous as well. So, and then they started trading with the Africans and supplying the goods which they wanted. And that's how they flourished, built schools, hospitals, and either through the community, and you know, had a proper living.
the SS Truro and the SS Belvedere. They were two ships that brought indentured laborers from India. There were many, I think, from the South India part, many from Bihar. They were the first group of people who came as laborers to work on the sugar plantations. Because the South African government at that time found that they needed workers on the sugar plantations. And the Zulus, the black population, the Zulus, were not ready to work there. Historically, it says that they got laborers from China earlier, and they got laborers from certain parts of Asia, but they didn't work out. So India was the next catchment area. And people were hoodwinked into coming there on the basis that said after 5 years you'll be free, you'll be able to own property, you can start business, you'll be free Indians. After your indenture is over, you can remain in the country. So people all left and thought, hey, this is great, bingo. The British government. The British authorities in South Africa, because Natal was a British colony. Remember South Africa before the Union, the Cape Province and Natal were under the British, and the Transvaal and Orange Free State were under the Dutch. There were two colonial powers that owned these four states, these four provinces. So the British in South Africa that were running the colony of Natal spoke to the British in India to send Indian laborers, what they eventually said, coolie laborers, they were coolies. That was the word they used, to come and work in the plantations. But when these people came, the plantations was not normal work. They were treated like slaves. They were beaten up, women were raped, people were killed. If you change your indenture, you got beaten up. So you were enslaved. Eventually, when those people became free, the Natal government said, you can't stay now, go back. But they said, we came here for 5 years, we were told we'll be free. They said, no, there's nothing sort, you go back again. Now that was in 1860. That whole case only got fought when Gandhi came in 1894. Their whole case got a shape 34 years later. But between 1860 and 1870, indentured laborers came in. In 1870, the new situation required small business people. So now the catchment area is no longer Bihar or South India. It becomes Gujarat, because Gujarat was pushing people out because of the drought and famine, and South Africa was sucking them in. So now you get a new group of immigrants who are largely Muslims from Gujarat, the Surtis, Memons from Gujarat, Ismailis, Parsis, some of the Hindus, Patels and Shahs, Jains. So you get a different type of group of people who were much more linked to India. The earlier group lost its connection with India because they went into the plantations, very much like Guyana, Fiji. So they lost contact with India. The second group had contact with India.
You'd come to a very posh area of Masindi, which is on the hill, and very big houses, with beautiful gardens and lots of space to live in and so on. They all would be for the British and the English, or who would probably be judges or headmasters or doctors or lawyers or in very senior positions. And they would have their own servants, they would have car parking, for their garages and so on. And then if you came down from the hill to sort of middle area, you'll find all the Indians living together. And because, I mentioned to you earlier, the majority of the Indians settled in Uganda were Gujaratis. There were a few Punjabis. So you'd have that distinct area where you only see Indians there. If you walked in the town, there was all the Indians would get together and having a chat, or the women would having a small chat outside there, what we call the veranda. Sit outside and talk about everything that goes around in the small town. And then if you go down into the sort of left side of Masindi, you'd find you come to a shanty town, and the Africans would live there. And they would not have proper water supply, and their homes would be very shanty. A lot of children There's no proper facilities in terms of cleaning those areas and so on. So we'd have three distinct areas, and I think they still exist. Even if you go to Kampala, you'll see three distinct areas. So, and what British cleverly did was to use the Indian or the Asian community to communicate with the Africans, and the Africans would use the Indians to communicate with the British. That's how those three distinct areas, and how the British used the Indian community. They would not have a direct link with the Africans, and the Africans would not have a direct link with the white. The other thing, if you look at the salary structure or the pay structure of any organization which exists in anything from schools to hospitals to wherever, you'll find there's three scales of pay. Say a white person would get, say, £100 for doing that job, and the same job an Indian would do it for £60 maybe, and an African would do it for around £20–25. So they have this sort of scale, even though the skills required would be the same, whether it's done by an Indian or by an African or by the white person. So this was ingrained in the society for so many years, very similar to apartheid system in South Africa.
My name is Ghanshyam N. Patel. I went from Karamsad after graduation as civil engineer to Uganda. Between 55 and 61, I worked as a private practice architect and civil engineer and joined Madhwani Group of Industries in 1961 to 1972 as chief civil engineer, and my main offices for working was at Kakira sugar factory, which had 22,000 acres of sugarcane estate with 3,000 bags of sugar production in 24 hours. So I had done all the resurvey of sprinkler irrigation out of those 22,000 acres near the Victoria Lake, and Jinja was the power station on the bank of the Lake Victoria, from which Nile river started and the power station was installed. So at Kakira, this factory served the needs not only for the people of Uganda, but they could export also extra sugar which was produced.
Zanzibar, as we call it, was like Ramaraja, meaning, the kingdom of Rama, where everybody's happy, everybody's happy-go-lucky, and so on. So we grew up in different religions being practiced on the island, and yet we lived in our own society. The Hindus had their own schools, their own social activities, religious activities, and so on. The Muslims would have their own. And now among Muslims, there were, of course, Indian Muslims as well. And then there were African Muslims, and there were Arab Muslims. So everybody, we lived side by side, and we didn't interfere into each other's affairs. And yet there wasn't that kind of assimilation that we talk about, And there wasn't racism either. So everybody live and let live.
Idi Amin had announced that we will be deported. And also he mentioned the £10 million aid which the British government had promised him, and they were not giving that money to him. And this was, again, a revenge attack, but then he mentioned all these, sabotaging the economy, and milking the economy, not integrating all those, points he mentioned. So the next problem was, how do we get the visa to, because the British had imposed a visa system on us, rather than saying, okay, you are British, so you just come over and we'll look after you. No, you have to go through the visa system. So there was long queues outside the British High Commission. We had to wait outside the British High Commission, to get the visa to come here, and we had to queue. And what the Amin's men used to do was to because we had to queue maybe for the whole day or sometimes even overnight. So we would have a lunch box, whatever, with us, or some other Indians would come and help us, bring us. So they would steal this from us, They would not even, the Amin's man would not even allow us to eat outside while we were waiting to get our visa. The other problem was the number of flights. There weren't enough flights to bring us all here. So who's going to organize that? So, and obviously British High Commission was, the High Commission was active. But there's a problem in this country because I don't think initially Mr. Heath's government was happy to allow us in for his political reasons. And if you look at the cabinet papers, in those 1972s, you'll find that Edward Heath was talking in the cabinet to send us either to Falkland Islands or to Fiji Islands or the Solomon Islands. He didn't want any one of us to come here. Obviously, he was trying to salvage himself from the political comeback if he allows 40,000 people to come into the country suddenly, and the impact it will have on the social services and education system and all the other aspects. So he wasn't very happy with that either. Maybe he knew inside that these are refugees and they are British passport holders. They have to come here. They can't go anywhere else. No other country will. India would not accept. Indira Gandhi said very clearly that we don't want. These are British subjects, so let them go to England. This Mrs. Indira Gandhi, yes. Yeah. You can see how shocked we were and how nervous we were. And it's very difficult to describe those feelings, especially those 90 days we had to go through. Because somebody asked Idi Amin, why have you given these people 90 days to leave? And he says, look, these Indians have the habit of giving 90 days credit, so let's give them 90 days to live. As you can imagine the state of the Indians there, very few, about 80,000 in the country, about 30,000 holding British passports. And the journalists coming in from various countries coming to interview Idi Amin. And I still remember somebody was asking Idi Amin, said, look, if they don't leave, what will you do with these Indians? He said, I'll teach them a lesson, he says, yeah, so what will you do? And then this journalist was telling, would you set up camps? I said, yes, I'll set up camps for them. So, and then somebody said, would you set up camps in line with what Hitler did, in concentration? He said, yeah, I'll do that as well. So, he was moving into that direction. All those fears, you can see what the Indian community was going through, the waiting at the British High Commission, and what, and this is really embarrassing as well, that, it comes 10 o'clock, they would shut the High Commission office for the tea break. And they knew there are hundreds of people waiting outside, and some of them have slept overnight. Some of them coming from villages like mine, Masindi, and Lira, and all the other towns. And then comes 1 o'clock, it's closed again for the lunch break, and they would come back at about 2, 2:30, and while we were just waiting outside to get our visas to come here. The other problem was, so even we say, okay, fine, we'll wind everything up and go. And we were the last ones to leave because my father didn't want to leave Uganda because he said, look, I don't want to, I've been here for 45 years, and this is my home. I don't want to leave Uganda. So he wasn't prepared even mentally, so you can see what he must have gone through. So the other problem which we had was the roadblocks. We had to go through all the roadblocks which Amin's man has set up, and these soldiers, about 18, 19 years old soldiers, they used to harass us. They used to steal whatever you had. Sometimes they would, some of the women would wear anything in their ears, so they would just take it out, without even asking them to remove, so you can see what the torture was going on. And quite a few of people suffered through the roadblocks because they were looted again by Idi Amin soldiers. But there was not only one roadblock, there were so many. I would say 20, 30 before we reached Entebbe. There were so many horror stories from so many different people. Some, they were showing guns on their neck, and some of the older women and all the children were thrown off the vehicle, and then they were looted, and everything good was taken away from them. So those horror stories will remain. But the other thing, if you talk about Idi Amin, was that, okay, he was able to deport us. And there were about 4 or 5 Asians who were killed. But if you take stock of the Africans who were killed during Idi Amin's time, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Probably the figures mentioned around 300,000 to about 500,000 who were killed or slaughtered by Idi Amin. Africanization means Africans are in charge and they control those government departments to businesses and so on. What it also meant was that they restricted the number of licenses they issued to the Indian community, especially those who were British citizens. They had to struggle to get a license to trade because every year you had to renew your trading license, and they would say, sorry, we'll not renew your license this year, or you can't sell this, or you got to move somewhere else. Give the Africans top priority. And also the government's idea, the idea was to make sure that the Africans do take control of that aspect of life.
If you have children, 3, 4 children, nobody will give you a house. They will say, how many children? This is 3, 4 children. They say, no, we don't give. If you are single, it's okay. You can share one room. Otherwise, it was difficult to get a house. Job, the same thing. There were no other jobs other than factory work. So in Lancashire, there were 200 mills in Bolton in those days when I arrived here. And you go to any of the mill, textile mill, the job is there. It was easy to get a job. On the first day when I went there, I was told that you pick up any job, because if you wanted to bring your family, you need a sponsor. And if you don't have a job, you cannot bring the family here. So I said, I must get a job. So once I get a job, I get a sponsor. Make up a sponsor, send it them to Kenya so they can come here in 3, 4 months' time. That's what I did. So immediately, I went to Bolton, I stayed with my friend, and they all got together and they were telling me the same story. They say, here there are no other jobs. Factory job is the only job, and you must pick up temporary. Later on, you may find the right job. Otherwise, in office, you will never get a job. I went to Barclays Bank. I had an account there with them. And I asked one of the clerks. He said, no, you can't work in a bank. I said, I've got 15 years experience. 15 years banking done with a British bank. They said, no, that was in Kenya, not here. You don't have any experience here. He said, we need somebody who is experienced here. I said, well, the only experience I can get if you give me a job here. So I spent 10 years working in factories, doing 12 hours night. I did 7 years, 12 hours night, for 7 years. The whole world is sleeping, you are working in the factory. It was a hard job. Pulling those belts of 200 kilos, you see, on the trolley, put them, you see. I was a banker. It was not my job, you see. That could drive you mad, you say, when you think it. But then the question of survival, you say, how to bring up the family. But because the children, they were already there, they were progressing well, and in a short time, they finished education, went to the college, university, they got all the qualification. So when I count those things, that is the real bonus for me. I don't regret for working hard. I don't regret to say anything for anyone. But still, I owe a lot to this country as well. You see, they have given me something. Otherwise, if I was in Kenya in those days, I could never send my children to UK for higher education. It was very expensive. Only the very rich people from Kenya, they were sending the children here. Ordinary people cannot send them here. But because I was here, the children had a chance to study, to get the education, and they are doing it. My children, my grandchildren also, they are all educated here now. So in that sense, the things are changing. But 68 year, for 1968, the things were different. But then, as the time went by, the British people, they recognize that these Indian people, they are all right, they were part of the society, and they were just merging with them, working together, and now we can see the result now. It's all positive.
As a publisher of a Gujarati paper, I accept very positively the change in demography and the change in need of mother tongue or language. Jewish people, their mother tongue was Hebrew or Yiddish, and in this country there are about 300,000 Jewish people. There was a fantastic system of cultural transmission and many more. How many of them speak Yiddish or Jewish or Hebrew? I'm not much worried, because though we have promoted language teaching for Gujarati, and in our way our future is involved there, I can't be blind. Why my grandchildren or your children learn English, speak English, think English? Common sense. But if you learn Gujarati or Punjabi or Marathi or whatever your mother tongue, it's an extra advantage. I am able to speak 3, 4, 5 languages and understand few more. And I believe in that scientific research that if you got more linguistic knowledge, it is good for your brain power. It is one way to put away the onslaught of dementia. But language, look, every week some language in the world die. But it is a fact of life. But to go back on my own calculation, we have done some business plan. So in this country there are about 800,000 Gujaratis. That is what I believe to be true. That is permanent residents. The students and visitors are different. Out of them, 55% are born in this country. So don't expect them to be Gujarati scholars. Though they go to, there are about 400, 500 weekend schools that teach Gujarati. People can speak but can't read and can't write. So what? As long as they know what is Gujarati nuances, culture, traditions, values, or Indian, for Gujarati is just part of India. Remember, only 5% of India is Gujarati. So I'm not worried about Gujaratis. I'm talking all Indian language which came from Indo-European tradition, which is mainly Sanskrit. To put it in a different context, as long as my reader, that's why we got Asian Voice paper, which is becoming more successful. It was typical Gujarati attitude, where Gujarat Samachar viable, so we started Asian Voice about many years ago, and it is viable. It is open for everybody. I know that there are readers who are not even Indians. So, future of print media will depend upon the quality of the reading material and other services they provide. One thing I believe, and I think about it all the time, if so many decades work is today's ABPL publications, I don't want it to die when I pass away. I hope to live another long life, but then again, who knows?
We came up with Navras because Navras is a concept that's over 2,500 years old, and it is obviously it's not just relating to Indian classical music. It relates even more perhaps to dance form, to sculpting, painting, theatre. So it's an all-encompassing concept, and so we decided we will use that concept and we will use that name for our record company, and so that's how we started. Our main ethos was that because Indian classical music is improvised, it is perhaps at its best when it's presented live. You can get an artist into a studio and it can be an afternoon and you tell them to sing an evening raga and they will do a wonderful job because they're highly trained professional people. So it's not that they would not do it, but at the end of the day, it will lack the spontaneity of a live performance without interacting with an audience. It may be the time of the day, time of the season, something that you cannot create no matter how much you try in a studio. So we decided, since Jay had all these recordings which were live, we will continue to do these things. And every time the artist's album was being released, we will have them over to come for a concert and record again, and at the same time release some other recordings. That's how we started. Now, as it happened, there were 2 or 3 musicians who were very, very keen to start Navras because they liked the idea of what we were thinking of doing, live recordings. And they had also got some early recordings when they were younger artists with Jay in his catalog, in his archives. And so the inspirational people behind Navras, apart from ourselves obviously, were the artists like Pandit Shiv Kumar Sharma, Pandit Hariprasad Chaurasia and Ustad Sultan Khan. These 3 individuals become really, if you like, people who said, you have to do this and we will help you with it.
I thought to my husband, I said, let me go to England first and I will see, because I'd heard about racism and so on. And Ugandan exodus had happened as well by then. And so we were a bit worried about, what could happen in Kenya as well. Should we make a move to Britain? We were enjoying our jobs, so there was lots of jobs were Africanized, but not the teaching jobs. So we were fine staying there, but we wanted to move to a city, which was almost impossible. So I came over with my 5-year-old daughter and decided to study for librarianship. And because of my teaching experience and qualifications, I thought I would join ILEA, the Inner London Education Authority. By that time, I said to my husband, it's fine, come and join us now, because I don't think, I need to go, we need to go back, and then I just got this job with like 10 minutes interview with ILEA. It was a wonderful opportunity for me because I learned to be supported there. It was a school library service system, so we would send out bulk loans to schools, and we did research for the educational officers and teachers and so on, so all sorts of things. So having been a teacher, it was really wonderful, and I came across lots of children's literature as well, which was totally strange for me. And so that was 2 years I spent there. The Academy's motto is read Gujarati, write Gujarati, learn Gujarati and live Gujarati. So because its motto is to keep the language, literature and culture of Gujarati alive in this country. What happened is while I was working, I worked from 77 till 99. I retired a year before I was 60. So it was the peak of kind of multiculturalism, and the demand was there. What had happened is when we first arrive in a country, our main job as immigrant is to look some kind of security in terms of job. So you're worried about your work. Once you find a work, you find a home, you manage to buy a home, gradually you settle down, and then you start looking at other cultural needs. And your children matter to you, and because in East Africa, although as I said, we were living in Africa, we lived Hinduism or we lived Indian culture. So we didn't have to worry about teaching our children anything. Here we had to make sure that our children didn't lose it. So then we started paying a little bit more attention on our children. My message is enjoy the culture you come from and enjoy the culture you live in.